the Vice Chairman of eCube Investment Advisors, which is one of India's first investment management companies in the ESG space.
Great, thank you. And Rama, turning to you last.
Yeah, good afternoon, and again I thank KPMG and Mr. Anish Day for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm Dr. Ram Kumar, Director R&D and Head of the Corporate R&D Center of Indian Oil Corporation, which is the largest oil refining and marketing company. I spent here my entire career. This is 32 years when I last counted. So I am heading this R&D center right now, which is concentrating on, besides our core competence of refining and lubricant technologies, there's a great focus right now with us, with the organization, as well as with my R&D center on renewable energy, as we aspire to transform ourselves from a mere oil company to an energy company in the next 5 to 10 years.
We look forward to discussing some of those topics. Just to introduce the session, I have worked in the renewable energy industry for the past 20 years. When I started off in this industry, it was very much early stages working with developers. And one memory will always stick out for me, which was access to capital. We struggled to get investors to come into the industry in the early days because nobody understood it. Nobody understood the economics. And I will never forget, I did a 2 megawatt transaction in Scotland in 2003, and it was actually one of the most important transactions in my career because it established a benchmark price for how to value renewable energy investments. And before that, we were guessing. Nobody knew what were the discount factors, what did the investment community think. And since then, it's been an incredible journey where actually we now roll forward 20 years later and there are more investors than there are projects available for investment. And it's wonderful to see new participants join. Every month of the year, I get a call from a new pension fund or an insurance company or a corporate who wants to participate in renewables because it's become a very, very investable proposition. However, the world has also moved on, and now we're in a world where climate change and decarbonisation is critically important. We're in a world where there are various estimates where something like 90 trillion of new expenditure will be required to achieve a net zero future over the next 10 to 15 years. Frankly, it doesn't matter whether it's 50 trillion, 90 trillion, or 200 trillion. It is a lot of money by any stretch of the imagination. What has been happening is that we are developing new technology solutions, and we will talk briefly about some of them this morning, particularly hydrogen, which to me represent the new frontier of where we were with renewables 20 years ago, new areas to invest in. Yet there is a challenge, and it's a really important challenge as we think about a net zero future. And that challenge is, how do we bridge the investors, and particularly those investors who come with an ESG agenda, to the emerging opportunities, recognizing that there is inherent risk amongst all of these different opportunities. So that's the broad agenda I want to discuss. Each of these panelists come at this from a completely different perspective, and I'm going to really look forward to interacting and making this an informal discussion, but we will begin with some questions. I'd also like to say to the audience, there is a facility by which you can raise questions, so please feel free to do so. I'll try and keep an eye on a different screen on the questions as they come through. We're leaving 10 minutes at the end, but if I do see any pertinent questions as we conduct the conversation, I might raise them. So, Rama, I'm going to begin with you. And, there's lots of different aspects to this whole area of investment and new technologies, but at the heart of it is government policy, I've come to understand the importance of government policy in my work throughout the world. Very interested in what the new Biden administration is doing. Clearly, the EU Green Deal is having a very significant impact, and I might comment a little bit on that later. But I'd love to get a perspective from you on where the government of India is on this in terms of today, and what type of vision does the government of India have over the next 10 to 15 years, please?
Thank you, Mike. It's a good question to start with, especially when we are holding this conference in India. India is having, especially Indian government is having a host of measures for decarbonization. It started with the Paris COP21, where India declared its INDC of reducing 35% of the emission intensity from the 2005 levels by 2030. They also declared and committed that they will create at least 175 gigawatts of renewable power by 2030. And also, India committed as a government, as a country, that India would be creating an additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide. So I think, as per the latest Bloomberg report, which assessed these INDCs, which were declared by respective countries at Paris COP21, I'm extremely pleased to share with you. I mean, not that you would not be knowing it, but India is one of the very few countries which is on course to meet the commitments. We have already installed. We have an installed capacity of 136 gigawatts of solar energy. I mean, not solar alone, but the renewable energy. And recently, our Honorable Prime Minister has actually stretched this further. He has given a new target of renewable energy. So by 2025 or 2030, now it has been doubled to 450 gigawatts, and which we all believe, and we have the confidence of achieving this new target. Besides that, government is very decisive in some policy interventions. For example, the national biofuel policy was enunciated in 2018, which seeks that there will be a 10% blending of ethanol in transportation fuel, so that the import bill can be reduced to that extent, and emission reduction can happen. And it also declared that its aspiration of raising this percentage from 10 to 20 by again 2030. And to enable the availability of this kind of ethanol for a large and vast country like ours, a slew of measures were announced, whether it is converting agricultural biomass into ethanol, or converting organic waste or waste into compressed biogas, so that our usage of gas can be risen from current 6% to 15%. And we are leading, in fact, our Honorable Prime Minister is leading the International Solar Alliance, and we are all part of the International Solar Alliance. Electric mobility, government has come up with at least two schemes, what we call FAME, faster adaptation of manufacturing of electric vehicles. A lot of incentives were there. In the FAME 1 policy, which was announced in 2015, it was only concentrated on private vehicles, but the latest version of FAME, what we are calling it as FAME 2, it will concentrate on public transport, and huge money has been pledged by government to be dispersed in the name of incentives for moving from IC engine based mobility and traction towards electric mobility mode. Also, two initiatives which are worth mentioning, that as a country we have skipped the Euro 5 emission levels, and straight from Euro 4, or what we call it as Bharat Stage 4 or BS4, from BS4 emission compliance, we have straight away leapfrogged into BS6, which no other country in the world has done it. And massive investments in petroleum industry and automobile industry have gone in to make it a reality. And this year in 2020, while we are grappling with COVID, silently our nation has moved from BS4 to BS6. Every single drop of fossil fuel that is produced in India is now of Euro 6 or BS6 quality. We have also announced national efficiency norms. So all these measures, I mean, backed by government intent and initiative, they all are decisive steps and announcements and deeds on our path to decarbonization. I think I'll
If I
stop
could make
at
Thank you, Rama. If I could make a comment, I've noticed other countries, particularly in the region we're looking at today, making net zero commitments. But I've always been fascinated by the policy of the Indian government. Long before government started making these net zero commitments, the Indian government was at the forefront in really defining clear policy objectives, particularly around renewables. And from my perspective, when I talk to investors, that is such an important signal, because we knew when investors came to India to invest, really strong signals from government is one of the key things that we look for every time.
yes.
So with that, you spoke about some of the technologies, and I want to spend a little bit of time in this session looking at technologies. I'll come back to you and talk about hydrogen specifically, Rama, but before I do that, I'd like to turn to Govind and talk about the mobility in India. I keep hearing about electric cars, but particularly about electric buses in India. So Govind, I know you've been involved and you have some perspectives. Would you mind sharing with us where you think the mobility industry is in India today, and what does the future hold for it?
Yeah, I think thanks, Mike. The obviously the perhaps one of the most high-profile policy initiatives of the Indian government has been in the area of mobility, perhaps second only to the what they have done in renewable energy. Uh, as Mr. Ramkumar pointed out, you have the so-called FAME 1 and FAME 2 subsidies, which are extremely important for this mobility sector to take off. Now, in the context of mobility, I will start with the the end use of the mobility, which is usually a two, a three, or a four wheeler. And in India, I think interestingly, it would appear that the two and three wheelers are likely to be at the forefront of some of these mobility mobility changes, in large part because the initial capital investment for those are low. The payback periods are extremely high, and there is an ecosystem which I think is evolving for these entities, particularly in the COVID sort of period. We are beginning to find that two trends are important. One is some people seem to want to move away from public transport because it's just safer to sort of be traveling alone. And in a country which is not particularly wealthy, two wheelers tend to be, let's say, a chosen mode. Secondly, there is a significant move towards delivery of various sorts, and for delivery of goods, these two and three wheelers tend to be fairly sort of efficient. Obviously, the fuel cost is almost zero; it's very low, and so on. So, therefore, I think that there is a significant offtake that we are beginning to see over there. Uh, you referred also to the question of buses. I think buses pose a slightly different problem. In the case of two wheelers, for instance, or three wheelers, the difference between a diesel version or a petrol version and the electric version in pricing exists, but it is not all that vast. In the case of buses, we find that the price of a electric bus is typically about 3.5 times that of a diesel bus, and that tends to be a challenge for fleet operators and so on. Now, if you want to offset that by the fact that there are slightly lower running costs, you usually need to have long-term contracts for whatever work you're doing, and you need some kind of sophisticated lease type of financial sort of structure. So I think those are kind of being worked on, and those typically operate successfully in the municipal bus segment. So you find a lot of momentum now from cities like Rajkot, Surat, Bombay, Bangalore, and so on, where there are these contracts, and you have these sort of three parties usually participating in it, usually a manufacturer, a fleet operator, and potentially a sort of financier coming together to bid for this. Because of the economics of this, buses, at least in this space, work well when they have a lot of utilization. So we don't see the private bus market, namely, say, companies like TCS and Infosys and so on, which also hire fleets for their employees. We don't see that as being, let's say, the first mover. I think we see that as probably something that will happen once, let's say, battery costs and so on reduce. within India, there's a fairly good ecosystem of both two-wheeler, three-wheelers, as well as bus manufacturers, both in the mid-segment as well, of course, as very large companies like Tata Motors or Ashok Leyland and so on. So, we sense that a lot of the heavy lifting is going to happen through some of these players themselves, as also some new players that you have who have come in, like Ather Energy and the Reva Group and so on, who have also set up these dedicated electric facilities. So I think that is probably my take on this. We'll have a lot of momentum in two and three wheelers and buses in the municipal space, probably four wheelers and buses, etc., in the private space. A little bit. Over to you, Mike.
Great. Thank you very much, Govind. Santosh, I want to turn to you. I mean, we're hearing about some of the interesting developments in India, both at the policy level, clearly mobility, and we'll talk a little bit about hydrogen. Can you give me some perspectives from your dealings with foreign investors? Do you see India as an attractive location for foreign investment into the broad decarbonisation sector? And what type of challenges are we seeing in practice when foreign investors come to talk to you?
Well, thanks, Mike. First of all, there should not be any doubt that we are, attractive when it comes to foreign investors. But specific to the question in terms of the renewable space, let me touch upon that first, and then I'll come to the other segments. Now that the ESG due diligence is a must in most deals, I can say firsthand that we are seeing an increased foreign investment in this renewable space. It's not just already existing investors, but we are seeing new investors. So we are having some new deals with new investors which are happening now. My view is strengthened as I read the latest report, which got published only a couple of weeks back with CEEW and IEA. So I think they also talked about the kind of increased investments. But we should also look at it from the context that these opportunities are increasingly available across the world. So in that context, how India will be more attractive. So that would be the context in which we have to see. Of course, that report, one of the a couple of things which it was mentioned over there is interesting is that the new sanctions which happened at the utility scale projects even during the COVID times, so that really has picked up with the investors. But the study also states that the equity return expectation have edged upwards. Unlike other parts of the world, even the debt terms have not accommodated the current kind of monetary conditions. So that's kind of a potential thing which might have a kind of a impact as we move forward. Maybe that's something which has to get adjusted at some point of time. Now, specific to India, I would say the risk perceptions stem from policy and market uncertainty, because there is this kind of potential contract renegotiations by off-takers. That's something which is kind of worrying signals. And of course, in terms of the supply chain uncertainties, including the pricing, because of the trade issues and all those things stemmed out of the COVID-19. So I think that's one of the risks, what I would say is kind of challenging for India. Currency valuations is a risk, but I would say that every infra investment where the investment currency and the revenue currency are different, you can expect the same kind of risk. So there is nothing specific I would add to that in the renewable space. One more thing, which I would say is the distribution companies, their financial weakness and concerns over the contract renegotiations. These would be key issues that we will have to attend towards a sustained attractiveness with foreign investors. I'm also hearing some dampeners or constraints related to land-related issues. So that's also something which some of the foreign investors need to be aware of. But definitely, this is the market, and so stepping out of renewables, I think every other sector, whether it is transport, energy efficiency, buildings, water or waste, all of them which have a potential impact towards decarbonization, all have good potentials in India. But of course, each one will have their own unique challenges as well. But the potential is very much there, because this is kind of the market in terms of volume. Huge. So I think we continue to be an attractive market over there. But yes, there are some very specific kind of challenges around this.
You made an interesting comment, Santosh, that the return expectations have increased in India. I think you're referring to that.
Sorry, I missed you.
What is the cause of the increase in expectations around returns?
So I think the overall sentiment and the way in which the business has been growing and what has seen in the past. So I think that is something which is kind of when some of the new investors are coming in, they are coming in with some of the pre notions about how this has kind of worked out here in India. So I think it will moderate over a period of time, but I think at present the expectations are on the higher side.
Okay. One other question I wanted to ask you about foreign investors. Do you think it makes sense for foreign investors to team up with local companies in India instead of trying to do everything on their own and coming in cold into the Indian market?
Definitely yes, and maybe first hand I would ask maybe Govind, you want to go with that? You would be the right person to say how well it will work out.
Yeah, I mean, thanks. I mean, there is no sort of gainsaying the sheer complexity of the Indian politico-economic environment. So I think that now you have two classes of investors. There are some who know India extremely well and who've been here for many years. So I guess those kinds of people actually have their their shop over here, and they don't need any sort of introductions. Others, who are relatively new, who probably do need a partner. Having said which, having been on one side of JVs with Tatas and with many other partners, I think that any kind of partnership with Indian entities tends to be fraught with challenge. You need to find partners you can align with, see eye to eye with, have broadly the same time period during which you can expect, let's say, returns and so on, because too many sort of partnerships have sort of struggled. But without getting into too much detail, there are, I think, different ways in which you can partner. I mean, one of them is to sort of have companies like KPMG sort of hold your hand during that process. There are, other partnerships which involve, sort of minority Indian players. So, but I think you certainly need that if you want to succeed, especially in a space which is as new and unknown as some of these areas related to climate change and ESG and green technologies and so on.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Govind. Shalini, I'd like to bring you into the discussion from a slightly different angle. As I think about the climate change and decarbonisation area, clearly we're talking about new technologies. But even beyond what I would call the existing new technologies, which we know that work, we just need to get the cost down. There's a world of innovation happening. I've seen it right throughout the world, and it's a topic I feel really passionate about, and how we can support innovators. And actually, I've had some exposure to innovators in India, and I know it's something that it's very prevalent in India. Can you talk to me a little bit about the innovation agenda and the innovation ecosystem, what you're seeing? And I'd like to debate with you some of the real challenges that these innovators have in bringing their new solutions to market.
Yeah, sure. Mike, before I get into the innovations, I'd like to really comment on the mobility space, which Govind has touched upon.
You know well.
From the charge point operator perspective, which is a startup in this area. So I absolutely agree with Ram that there are a lot of government incentives, and that's the starting point. And there are new tenders coming up from each state government also. So this is a play between the state and the center. New bus tenders and etc. coming, but because of the capex heavy industry, especially because of the battery cost being so high. When the rubber hits the road, then a lot of debundling and granularity of that has to be taken into consideration. So, for example, let me give some examples, and we see that in the government tenders, you can't have a majority foreign stake, and it is bound to happen because the expense, the cost is so high that we will have some foreign players coming in and taking a key role, especially when the battery is largely imported. So that component is largely imported. I was also working in the three-wheeler, two-wheeler, where not from the vehicle side, but from the charging infrastructure side. Now, if the incentive given is on the entire vehicle, and you cannot take the incentive on the battery alone, the stimulus, then there is no debundling of it, and therefore you cannot really create a leasing option which would actually bring the cost down for the end user. So now with this new policy coming in, so we keep learning and we keep iterating ourselves. With this new amendment coming in by the Delhi government, we can avail of it. But by the time the RTO registration is allowed, by the time the real paperwork and all of that is allowed, a lot of time is going to be lost. So what I'm trying to say is, whether it was the Bharat charger, which did not have clarity on the software, and now we bring the granularity, or it is the debundling, decoupling of the battery from the e-rickshaw, so that cheaper, viable options are available. We will have to think more granularly for our policies to be effective. That's something that I wanted to mention on the mobility side. And coming to your question on the innovation, and again, India has been a laggard, I would say, in investing in research and development, and the way we would define research and development in the corporates is the big R and the small r. So I'm talking about deep research and something which is going to be commercially viable maybe in 10 years time, or the small r, which is more combined with the development. So while the private sector is going to be investing in the small r and the development side and the eco side, I think there needs to be much more that needs to be done by the government or the big R. And our spend in India is 0.2%. And while you compare it with China or US or Japan, they are twice or thrice as much. So I think there needs to be more thrust on the big R, and I'm sure Rama will agree on the IOCLs, biofuel plants, which have been delayed indefinitely, for a long time because of the viability concerns, which are slow and therefore the implementation gets slower. Or the 2G biofuel technology, which was also did not have a good absorption and therefore in the domestic market. So we have to be clear from the government on the direction, and therefore have these breakthroughs. Especially, I worry about the storage and the battery side of it. So, like we've had some innovation from ISRO, but I think more support needs to be given to make it commercially viable. And I completely keep stressing on that because I'm from the small and medium enterprise now, and therefore the commercial viability of all of this needs more intensive stimulus, and the pilots also need to be supported by the government.
Thank you. My own perception is that there is a lot of innovation happening, but it's happening independently of some of the larger companies. And we need to find a way to bridge the independent innovators with the larger companies, not just for funding reasons, but also as a test bed for some of the innovations that are being developed. Because I think we all agree we're not going to get to this so-called net zero future without more and more technology innovation. The solutions we have today are not big enough. I want to turn the discussion back to you, Rama.
Just a 1 minute interjection. Sorry for that.
Yep, please.
Is in terms of India to be self-reliant a little more in this net zero, or we have not yet put out the net zero, but in the decarbonizing journey, I think what Shalini mentioned in terms of the focus of the government in terms of research and innovation has to be there. Because globally, you have definitely seen the kind of private investment not moving much into deep tech. India has been a good destination when it comes to applied tech, but I think deep tech is something where the government need to spend their money. So I think that would be 1 minute. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would also like to respond before Mike comes to me on some other subject, since I'm in the thick of all these issues raised by both Santosh and Shalini. Especially she mentioned about the delay in biorefineries and 2G ethanol plants. I completely agree as a career scientist that government and country is heavily betting on 2G ethanol technology. But the technology is at best today is at TRL, at best at TRL 6 or 7 scale. And by the sheer force of the government, 12 biorefineries have been announced in the country. All three big oil marketing companies, which are under the aegis of Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas, they announced 3 plants each. But sitting on the board of Indian Oil, I am a board member of Indian Oil. I know how difficult it was to get through that proposal because the traditional hurdle rates and IRRs nowhere near to be satisfied by this. The current technology position. It's not A company or B company poorly planning it and not achieving the IRRs. The technology per se is still not mature. On the contrary, compared to 2G ethanol, the compressed biogas campaign, which government has unleashed in the name of SATAT, Sustainable Alternative Towards Affordable Transport, that is much more economically viable, and the bottom lines will make a lot of economic sense there. And government has announced that there will be 5,000 compressed biogas plants, which will convert the waste, organic waste, into compressed biogas, which is akin to compressed natural gas. And oil marketing companies, the government through us, oil marketing companies, will give the offtake guarantee to the private entrepreneurs who would like to set up these plants. And on the whole, we have already given 800 letter of intents. My own company has given more than 350 letter of intents for such plants, prospective plants. Whatever gas that they are going to produce out of that, we are going to give complete offtake guarantee and at an assured price. So this is the kind of assurance that we are doing. As far as 2G ethanol technology is now concerned, government has now announced a viability gap funding scheme. 150 crores of Indian rupees can be sanctioned to any commercial venture, any entrepreneur who would like to set up a 2G ethanol plant. He'll get a minimum 150 crores of rupees, depending on the size of the plant and the size of the technology. But still, that is very minimal, but still it's an initiative. Bottom lines may not be changing much with this 150, because we have seen one plant of 200 or 300 liters per day will cost you anywhere between 600 to 700 crores. So 150 crores of viability gap funding is not very big, but it is a good initiative by the government. And as an R&D scientist, I must also appraise Dr. Shalini that all over the world, including India, including my own center, we are actually improving this technology. The major reason for non-economic viability of 2G concept is that the yields of the ethanol are very, very low, and the waste part of it, that is lignin, after production of ethanol, the lignin is still being unutilized. So a lot of research focus is on both in government and private R&D institutes to valorize this lignin. Lignin is a hard plant substance, and this is being burnt in the boilers, which is actually counterproductive. So if this lignin can be converted into value-added chemicals, plastics, green plastics, then probably the bottom lines of the whole technology will be improved, and sooner than later, I think this will happen. A lot of promising results are there in the pipeline. They need to be scaled up. My own company, my own R&D is setting up a new demo unit where we are coming up with a brand new technology whose bottom lines are much better, and with lignin valorization corollary units added to this. So I thought I would apprise this at this point of time.
Thank you very much for sharing those insights, Rama. Going back to what you said about biogas and the way Indian Oil is going to act as a facilitator and an enabler for all of the private entrepreneurs is a wonderful model. I've seen the same concept being developed in other countries, and I think it's a great solution, and congratulations to Indian Oil for participating. I want to turn to another technology solution that I know is something that you think a lot about, and it's the hydrogen question. Wherever I go around the world these days, hydrogen comes up as it's the solution to all problems, no matter what the issue is. And a lot of debate around blue and green hydrogen. And in my own neck of the woods in Europe, the European Green Deal did something quite fascinating. It really put the emphasis on green hydrogen and didn't really talk too much about a transition to green through blue hydrogen. And it's very clear that the European Union plans to really do whatever it takes to enable a green hydrogen market through, and it could be developed through offshore wind or various other solutions. And we're already seeing projects. We're already seeing Shell have publicly announced an offshore wind project in the Netherlands where they're building a 200 megawatt electrolyzer alongside the plant to deliver hydrogen to mainland Europe. And we're going to see more and more of these type of projects. I'd love to get a perspective from you on the hydrogen debate, and also talk to me a little bit about the policy environment for hydrogen in India, please.
Thanks, Mike. This is also a very hot subject in India as well, elsewhere in the world, like elsewhere in the world. As a chemist, as a career chemist, let me say, in the light of wind, hydrogen is a colorless, odorless gas. But of late, we have given so many colors to this hydrogen in gray, blue, and green. That's, of course, not the light of wind. So, besides this chlor-alkali industries and some other chemical industries, Indian refining segment is the largest producer of hydrogen, because all our refineries run on hydrogen for so many refinery processes to get the desired fuel quality. So we are still the largest producers of hydrogen, and majorly our hydrogen production today is through fossilized sources, whether it is naphtha, which is one of the fossil stream out of crude oil, or natural gas reforming to hydrogen. So steam methane reforming to hydrogen. These are all gray. But I tell you that each of the refinery is having quite a bit of surplus amount of hydrogen capacity in the installed hydrogen generation units of this. So now the oil marketing companies, my company is leading the way in commoditizing this surplus hydrogen, and to start with the gray hydrogen itself, because we have a sound scientific logic. Even if it is a gray hydrogen, this is the lowest hanging, because when hydrogen is fed to even direct IC engine, internal combustion engine, leave alone hydrogen fuel cell based mobility options, the combustion efficiencies will go up. Govind will bear with me. The efficiency will improve. So by the sheer total life cycle emissions can be reduced. But having said that, in the near term, at least to turn the gray hydrogen into blue, the real crux is that what is the cost of carbon capture technologies? You can turn a gray hydrogen into a blue hydrogen once you conjunct it with appropriate carbon capture technology, because the carbon dioxide emissions which are associated with these steam methane today, by the way, of all the pathways, hydrogen pathways in the world, even compared to electrolyzer route, steam methane reforming is the cheapest pathway of producing hydrogen. So even if you hyphenate with some appropriate carbon capture technology, still SMR with CCU will remain in contention as an economically viable pathway. So the whole crux is how fast we can have economically viable carbon capture technologies. I can share with you, and you would agree with me, that in the whole world, on commercial scale, commercially viable carbon capture technology units are handful. And US DOE has already set a target for carbon capture to be 25 US dollars. When it becomes 25 US dollars, then it will become economically viable, and all gray hydrogen units can be turned into blue. But today, the carbon capture costs are hovering around 50 odd US dollars. So intense research is going on to cut down these costs. My own company, my own R&D, and several other schools around the world are working still on bringing down the carbon capture technologies. So at least we can convert gray hydrogen into blue hydrogen. Coming to green hydrogen, the kind of electricity costs through solar PV route plummeting in this country. It is few cents. The latest bid is, I think, just about 2 rupees. 2 rupees or maybe under 2 rupees. So people think that once the electricity cost becomes cheaper, the solar PV route electrolyzers may be a viable option, like in Europe, in India also. But I must also say here that the electrolyzer technologies are still, they have not reached economies of scale. So a lot need to be done to take the advantage of this lowering of the solar PV electricity cost. The electrolyzer technology also should keep pace, so that electrolyzer route for producing green hydrogen becomes a reality and a more adopted pathway. But as far as India is concerned, and my own company's bet is, the best promising green hydrogen pathway for a country like India, where there is abundant surplus biomass is there, is through biomass gasification route. And we ourselves are setting up biomass gasification demo units to produce absolutely green hydrogen. And my take would be just around $2 per kg. This is going to be the cheapest once the technology is perfected. We have a very active collaboration with one of the top research centers, Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, and we are setting up a demo unit in Delhi NCR region using the biomass for producing hydrogen, and our target is to produce it at around $2 per kg. So my bet is that biomass we need to concentrate on, just the way we are concentrating biomass as the feedstock for 2G ethanol and compressed biogas. Even for hydrogen, biomass holds the key.
Great, thank you very much. A long journey to go yet, but certainly with something we're going to hear a lot more about in the future. So we've spent some time talking about some of the technology solutions. I want to come back to Govind and Shalini on a couple of investor-related topics, if I could. And Govind, I'll start with you. I mean, you have been involved in setting up joint ventures and fund structures. Can you just give me some perspective about the reality of setting up climate and green investment funds, particularly in an Indian context? And I know you've done some joint ventures previously in your work with Tata.
Yeah, Mike. So I'll speak about this, in two parts. When you're talking of, let's say, climate or ESG related investing in the equity space, especially when you talk of public markets, uh, bringing about change in some of these areas requires two things. It requires, I think, a willingness to engage with managements and owners of companies, and it requires giving those entities time to make necessary investments in either climate efficient technologies or more generally in bringing ESG change in those companies. Now, unfortunately, the way pension fund trustees and so on around the world work, especially when they deal with public markets, they need almost complete liquidity. They are not really in this. In fact, mandates of many large pension funds, including many which I know in the UK and so on, do not permit them to take these kind of long gestation plays. So they sometimes tend to use the easy way out, which is to simply follow some kind of let's say green index or whatever it is, and end up essentially investing in the same companies which are already fairly green efficient and so on, and not necessarily bringing funding to those who need to sort of improve. So this problem, which is public market funds are not well suited for solving 3 to 5 year problems. They are suited really for putting money into companies, trading and exiting. So this is something which I think trustees, even let's say the Department of Works and Pensions in the UK and its counterpart in India and so on, need to look at. In India, there is a more specific issue which I think all of us know, which is that both insurance and pension funds are generally discouraged from investing in public markets, which means that the kind of long-term money which is capable of taking, sort of making investments which require long-term solutions is not in the market in the way that it ought to be. From equity, I will go to debt, which I think is an even bigger problem, because I think the amount of debt funding that you need to bring about this green transition is huge. Various studies, including something done by KPMG, have indicated that India needs something like 3 trillion to manage this transition in some of these major sectors like mobility and so on. The problem was articulated very well by Dr. Shalini, which is, if you want to solve for, to take the case she mentioned, I think, about the capital expenditure involved in mobility, these are complex problems, unbundling battery with the rest of the vehicle and so on. This is not something that the garden variety Main Street bank solves, because they are used to doing large numbers of loans of a sort of cookie cutter nature. If you want to structure financial products like this, you need, and you want transmission to take place, you need specialized institutions to do this. We have in India an example in the real estate space, where about 45 years ago a company called HDFC was set up. It is not as though the mainstream banking space cannot solve for housing. But if you look at what HDFC has done, and consequently many others, or subsequently many others, you have a range of specialized housing finance companies, whether it is for affordable housing or whether it is for green housing or whatever it is, who are able to solve problems. The bank system at large follows the financial solutions these kinds of institutions put in place. The problem about in this case is that investors are generally loath to finance greenfield entities of this sort, particularly when you have the the uh, the natural technological risks and uncertainties and imponderables that, let's say, this space has got. So they might give you a few million here or there, but if you want to basically get into lending, these are capital intensive businesses. You need someone who can write a 100 or $200 million check to get you off the ground. This is not very easy. I'm not suggesting that the large multilaterals will never do it, but this is not their sweet spot. They are generally much more comfortable with financing entities which are already established. And I think that is a space which clearly could be fulfilled over the next few years by the creation of an entirely new sort of set of financial institutions. One of which, of course, we tried to do when I was in Tata's, which was Tata Clean Tech Capital, which was a JV between IFC and Tata's. We didn't need to get funded because the Tata Group has deep pockets, and so we were able to get it off the ground. But then again, you face a different kind of problem there, which is, with all the best intentions, it ends up being a small part of a very large conglomerate. So obviously, there are issues of capital.
I think we've lost Govind.
Yeah, we lost.
I think we have.
Okay,
actually,
there. Yeah. So.
Okay,
back.
Yeah, are you able to hear me now?
Yeah.
Govind, so sorry, Shalini, can you continue?
Yes, Shalini, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I can jump in there, and I recognize what you're saying from Tata Group, from Schneider Electric, or from Philips. We've had these consortium of eco partners where different instruments have been used, whether debt funding or even grant or even convertible grants, and sometimes even use bridge financing for various solutions. However, I think the problem today is accentuated in the mobility space, where the utilization, it's a chicken and egg story. So because of COVID, there is a challenge on utilization, and if there is inadequate utilization or footfalls, there will be under absorption. Now, going to my previous experience of lighting, I did not face a similar challenge, and that's why these consortiums were very effective. ESL coming up with large tenders for 60,000 villages in India for solarization, or LEDification drive that we did, across India, and to really bring down the rates of LEDs to that extent, with mass production and creating opportunities for Indian manufacturing, space. And that's where even multilateral banks were interested, like ADB, and we got private sector involved from the manufacturing point of view and bringing down the cost, like Philips and Schneider and whichever else got into it. And the challenge today is now institution building for the implementation agencies as well, because the whole ecosystem needs to be put in place, and each one does good they are good at, and only then there is going to be productive use of our energy. Because it's not only about putting the ecosystem together, it's not only giving it a kick start with the stimulus, but also ensuring that this model runs and becomes productive for that end user. And I'll pause here because I can give lots of examples from lighting and now from EV, but I'm cognizant of the time. And Mike, over to you to have a question for all of us.
Thank you. In fact, we've lots of questions, and I will turn to the Q&A session. I'd love to spend more time with all the panelists, because in particular, I was hoping we get time to discuss the energy access question with you, Shalini, but I think we better give a couple of minutes to the audience, if that's okay. And I'm going to group some of the questions together. One question which has come through is this whole question of climate risk. And do we think investors are properly pricing climate risk into their investment valuations? Anybody want to take the question?
Okay.
Santosh?
I can go first on that. Okay. The first part is, are the investors pricing the thing? I think it's not reached a pricing stage. but I think the risk part of it is being factored well now, and that's what we are kind of currently seeing in terms of how the investors are looking into some of the dominant sectors where they want to invest. And that's also posing a kind of a challenge, Mike, is that we have two distinct segments now, and I think even in Europe you would be discussing this very often these days, is that you have a clean or a green, what we call, and then you have the other end, but there is the whole of this in between transition phase, which is I think the way in which some of the people are getting into is that where is the transition funding happening? Decarbonization has got a transition map. So I think that is also very critical, and there the investors are a little reluctant from this so-called, what I said, the risk perspective. But then are they pricing it? I think the moment they start pricing it, you will find that even in terms of this in-between funding which is required will pick up. So I think it's early days, especially in India. We haven't seen some of the investors very directly pricing this, but things are kind of happening in this space. So that's what I'll stop. So.
Yeah, thank you, Santosh. I mean, my own perspective, if I can offer a global view, is investors are getting much more attuned to climate risk. I've already seen developments in the UK market where leading activist investors are saying they're going to force shareholder votes on the performance of management on the climate question. There is increasing pressure on disclosure. TCFD is becoming mandatory in the UK next year. The direction of travel is very clear to me, and I personally believe climate risk will get factored in ultimately, and we need to make sure it's done in an orderly way because the impact could be quite dramatic.
No, risk, definitely what you say is right. They are factoring the risk part of it, and I would even go to say that some of the big investors are trading activists, the so-called Greenpeace in the investing field. But having said that, are you factoring the price part of it as part of your investment decisions? I think there is the small lag, which I don't see that.
Yeah. Yeah. So just time for one more question, and I might.
Sorry, what Santosh is emphasizing, I agree to that. It is there at the awareness level. It is there at the good to know level and at a reporting level. But are we factoring that in our financial statements? The risk, it is not yet happening as fast as we would want it to happen.
And I completely agree with that. And my thesis, Shalini, it's not happening yet, but it's going to happen. And we need to be aware of how big an impact it's going to have. Very quickly, just I want to get one other question in, which I'll probably even try to answer myself, and the panelists are welcome to offer a view. We've been asked, amidst all the buzz on decarbonisation, is there low cost of capital available for clean energy projects? It's a very fundamental question, and the only way I can answer that is it depends on the risk. Renewables. I mean, Santosh made the comment about cost of capital and the return expectations for renewables. In the part of the world I come from, we're seeing solar projects being priced at 4%, 5%. It's incredible. As we talk about the various new technologies, there is not low cost of capital available because there are risks. And we need to work. We need government policy to actually play its role in helping to scale these technologies. The more scaling, the more early stage investment, eventually the costs will come down and the cost of capital will follow as well. But we're not there yet. And that's the great challenge, as we face into this new future. So with that, we've reached the top of the hour. I would like to really thank all of my panelists, Shalini, Govind, Rama, and Santosh, my good colleague from India. It's one of those discussions that, frankly, we could keep going for the next 3 or 4 hours. I think what we've done is we've highlighted, some of the real progress that India is making, and it's a fascinating story right across the world, and I do keep a close eye on India. It's a country very close to my own heart, and it's wonderful to hear about some of the progress against all of the technologies. But also we've heard today about some of the practical difficulties, the real difficulties. They're not unique to India. They sit across the whole world as we attempt this incredible journey to decarbonise. So I hope for the audience you've learned something and heard some different perspectives, and I'd like to thank everybody for attending this afternoon.
Thank you very much, and lovely to meet all of you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Mike.
and
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
thank you, Mike, and thank other fellow panelists.